Hey, how's it going to be? Welcome back to another video. Today we have ourselves the PSP 3000 IPS glass laminated display. It took us 5 years to get here from the IPS on the 1000, but we are finally here. So is it any good? Is it worth $60? And what are the pros and cons? Well, in this video we'll be covering everything from the installation process to the battery life to, of course, the display quality. This is everything you need to know about the PSP 3000 IPS glass laminated display. So without further ado, let's get right into it. Alright, so first things first, this revision of the display will work best with original shells, and will in fact be a pain to install with clear shells. And you'll probably know why if you have watched my glass lens video. Basically, in order to do this mod, you need to go ahead and take out the original plastic lens, which is an absolute breeze on original shells, as well as the aftermarket Monster Hunter shells, so if you have one of those, you'll be fine. But when it comes to these things, you'll be spending most of your time removing the lens and cleaning up the inside area, as the lenses that come with these things are bonded together with the plastic of the faceplate. And once you do eventually remove it, you'll still run into issues where the plastic window here isn't the right size. In my case on this one, it's a bit too narrow, and even though I try to do some sanding, I still need to do a whole lot more if I don't want to see any backlight bleed, at least on pure black screens. If you don't care about backlight bleed, you can just use it as is. Just know that the screen will be pressed down unevenly from multiple different sides. So why is that, you may ask? Well, if you take a closer look, we'll notice that it has an integrated laminated glass lens mounted directly onto the LCD. And because of that, although it eliminates the problem of dust getting between the display and the lens, which is quite annoying to deal with, we now have less tolerance for anything that is misaligned. These lenses we have tested out in the past. They're very strong because it's tempered glass and is very resistant to scratches and scuffs, so using these on the daily is mostly a stress-free experience. And if you're still worried about scratches, just know that the display here comes with a pre-installed screen protector, as well as a protective layer to protect the screen protector during installation. But it's done in a way where you actually need some tools to get the best install. But before we get there, there's one last thing I want to go over. In regards to the aftermarket shells, I did actually think about delaminating the display, but that would be pretty risky and almost no one is going to actually try it. So I went ahead and asked them if they could release a version without the glass lens, and they have actually replied back and told me that they have something releasing next month with just that. If that's the case, once it does come out, I'll make sure to order some and let you guys know in the community post. Alright, so just a quick update. They have sent me a picture of the non-laminated version. It seems like they have it on hand, however they cannot list it until they have some kind of restrictions lifted, which we don't know much about. Nonetheless, it's most likely going to be the same panel, so you can reference this video for how that thing is going to look. And rest assured that there will be a video on it once I have it in hand. And while we're here, I might as well give you the secondary update that they are in fact working on a PSP 2000 version of the IPS screen, which is super exciting news for 2000 owners. And the final update I want to go over is that this version of the IPS screen will not work with the 07G model, aka the rare Chinese version. That being said, they have assured me that they are in fact working on a 07G version coming out later. So if you do have one of those, stay tuned. And if you don't know which version you have, the best way to go about it is to run PSP ident and take a look at the number right over here. In this case, we have the 09G, which is one of the standard revisions. Any future updates that come out after this video can be found in the pinned comment. Anyways, back to the video. So long story short, if you have a clear shell, I would recommend you go ahead and wait for the new model to come out that comes without a laminated display. For everyone else who has either an original shell or a Monster Hunter 3000 aftermarket shell, you're going to be perfectly fine with this mod and things are going to work out pretty well. Now I should mention that this mod, unlike the 1000 model, whoops, wrong button, does not require any soldering, as it is nearly a simple drop-in solution, which is fantastic. With that in mind, there are two main ways I would recommend you go about installing it. One is for those who don't care about screen backlight bleed, and if you don't know what that is, we'll go over it in this video. And the second one is if you absolutely hate backlight bleed, which I'll go in depth, step by step, on how I personally fully eliminated backlight bleed on several of my original models. So here's method 1. The top 3 things I would recommend you go ahead and do for the simplest, safest install are the following. Tip number 1 is to make sure you leave out the metal screen bar that sits right over here. They come in 2 different styles. Although the older revisions will work, the newer ones that wrap around the display will definitely not. Either way, I would recommend you go ahead and remove them anyways for the best results. Tip number 2, when installing the screen, make sure you take extra care of the backlight connector here. If it feels springy, that means it's going to break if you close it up. So what I recommend you do is to leave it halfway like so, and you'll be good to go. It's going to work perfectly fine. It's not going to slip out unless of course you drop your PSP, but at that point you have bigger things to worry about. And yes, it is normal to have some of the connector exposed like you see here. And the final and most important tip is to simply leave out the microphone. Completely disconnect it, making sure that you take along with it the gasket that's usually stuck on the front of the faceplate, and with older revisions, make sure that you take along with it the blue pad on the back of the media bar. And that's really about it. As for actually removing the lens, I would recommend you go ahead and watch my glass upgrade video as I go over different ways of how you can go about it. So that's the simple install method with the most basic things that you can do without having to do any cutting or modifying, other than of course removing the old lens. However, if you have a major case of backlight bleed, such as this one or this one, Well, with the next install method, you can actually make it look a little something like this, which pretty much eliminates backlight bleed. So here's how you can go about it. Alright, so to get started, you want to get your PSP, your new LCD, and a couple tools. That being a metal chisel pry tool, a pair of tweezers, a razor blade, a Phillips screwdriver, and depending on which model you have, a Torx 2 screwdriver. And I highly recommend you go ahead and watch my disassembly video, as I do cover all the different variants, how to take them apart, and put them back together safely. So we'll start off by completely disassembling the PSP, remove the faceplate, remove the bottom left trim, the media bar along with the microphone, disconnect all the ribbon cables, release the display, and the bottom media bar. And you want to put those aside in a safe place. And we might as well go ahead and remove the triggers, as they will flop around if yours don't have any screws. Oh, by the way, depending on which model you have, you may have a retainer that looks like this, which wraps around the display, or one that looks like this. In either way, you want to go ahead and remove these. And we'll go ahead and set it aside. And then you want to go ahead and grab your display, as there are a couple things we want to go over real quick. First off, here's what it looks like up close. We got an LCD screen that is, yes, thicker than the original. Here's what that looks like side by side. The original being around 2mm, while the aftermarket without the glass lens is 2.3. But with the glass lens and the screen protector, it's around 4mm. And right down here, we have a GoWin GW1N-UV2 FPGA chip, which essentially translates the signals from the PSP to work with this IPS panel. We got what looks like diagnostic pads, as well as two different connectors. This one goes to the PSP, while this one is most likely for programming the chip itself, which I'm hoping there's a way to actually reprogram the chip to have an increased level of saturation or contrast, or basically shift the gamma levels. That is something I'll be looking to in the future, but that's all I know for now. So let's go ahead and move on by flipping it over and getting things ready. First off, we have a piece of Kapton tape right over here pre-applied to basically insulate this connector when it's sitting a little something like this. At the same time, right down here, we have a piece of adhesive that you'll want to go ahead and peel out and stick it on while lining up this line right here with the edge of the display. Just like that. You don't have to worry about these pads shorting anything. Lastly, once again, this number right here is for my own reference, as I did order 5 units to test out. And finally, for prepping the actual display, let's talk about the built-in screen protector. Once again, we have a protector for the screen protector while you're doing the installation, as you can see right here, so we can go ahead and peel that. And you'll notice that it's not the clearest screen protector out there. And with most of my units, there were a few bubbles here and there, which we can clearly see here and here. Looks like some dust particles. And in my testing, I did find that the screen protector does hinder display quality ever so slightly. But of course, it's enough for me to remove it outright. What I do know is that the glass lens here is an absolute tank. We have smashed it with a hammer and poked it with a screwdriver multiple times in my glass lens video. You can watch that if you're interested. But essentially, I'm not too worried about scratches. So for me personally, I'm just going to go ahead and outright remove it. However, if you're looking to use it, there's one important thing that you need to do, and that will be to actually cut this little excess part, which is going to cause extra bubbles and extra pressure when you're looking to have no pressure on the display. So go ahead and grab yourself a piece of razor, a razor blade, whatever you can, just don't cut yourself, and cut it at an angle like so. And the cleaner you can get it, the better, as there is very little wiggle room when it comes to the actual cutout. And since I'm removing it anyways, here's what it looks like before and after, with and without the screen protector. It's a big difference. Alright, so like I said before, your mileage will vary. You may have more or less backlight bleed depending on your shell. Results will vary drastically. However, one thing for sure that you will 100% encounter is this little gap right over here. As you can see, it's a pretty huge gap, and the reason for that is the microphone gasket. Alright, so tip number 1. Start off by removing the microphone gasket. That will reduce or eliminate the gap that you have here depending on which revision you have. Some models, such as the older TA090 or 92, will have a little blue pad on the other side of the microphone, and the cutout is slightly different in a way where it's actually thicker, so you'll actually have to go ahead and remove the microphone completely for the best result. And if you have one of the newer revisions where the microphone is pretty flush, you can go ahead and keep it or just remove it outright if you're never going to use it, as it will save the hassle of having to deal with it every time you take it apart and put it back together. Since I'm not using it, I might as well go ahead and disconnect it. If I ever need it, I'll put it back together. Close that back up, and we'll set the display aside for now to get a better visual. So once again, if it's one of the older models, you'll have a blue pad over here, you'll have the microphone, and then the microphone gasket on top. Remove all three, and that will take care of the gap that is in the bottom left corner. Moving along, despite removing the microphone, you may still end up with a little bit of halo in the middle. And that doesn't start until you actually start screwing in the bottom middle screw here, as it will push this edge closer together. And to fix that is pretty straightforward. All you need is a pair of flush cutters and this little razor blade. And basically what you want to do is to cut and remove this little portion, just like that, followed by slightly trimming the top edge of this little line right here. Something like that will do. And if you want, you can go ahead and do the rest of it up to this point, just for good measures. Again, this all depends on the severity of your backlight bleed. That is specifically in this area here. The plastic here is kind of brittle, almost like it has air bubbles, so you can actually cut it with a razor blade with relative ease. And the reason we cut this area right here and reduced it is because of this little capacitor right over here. It's going to sit there nice and comfortably, and by shaving it, we're going to reduce any stress that we may have, again, if you have middle backlight bleed, even after removing the microphone. Next up, you may have some backlight bleed around this corner right here, and that usually is from the display pivoting across different angles, specifically with this alignment hole. That meets with this little pin right here. And basically, the best way to go about it is to simply snip it. In fact, that is something I actually do even with aftermarket displays, or sometimes original displays on aftermarket shelves. And that would stop the display from being pushed in too much on this side, and then pivoting and then causing uneven pressure. And if I remember correctly, the last thing you can actually do when it comes to uneven pressure on the bottom side of things, and it's most likely going to happen on later revisions, 93 and above, where they have the media bar secured under the bottom left trim. Really annoying, really not needed, because previous models didn't deal with that. So what you could do is to simply snip it. Just like that. That way, not only you can go ahead and lock this into place without having to remove the bottom left trim every time you want to take it apart and put it back together, and it will reduce the uneven pressure that you may have in that corner. So that's it for the tweaks on the bottom. Now let's go ahead and move on to the top. And of course, you can use a combination of these and figure out different solutions if you have uneven pressure in areas where I have not covered. Moving on, we can go ahead and remove the little speaker gasket right here. That could possibly be an issue for you. Might as well go ahead and remove it. I had an issue in the top right corner, and that was because of two things. This little spring, which was meant to push up the thinner original displays, and this part of the trigger retainer / stabilizer. So what we can do for the trigger is grab the razor blade and carefully shave it down by 1 millimeter or so. Be careful not to cut yourself, and if you cut too much, you might end up actually snipping this part, but that's perfectly fine, at least for the right side. Something like that should do. And then you can simply pop it back in. Now for the little spring right here, what you could do is simply push it in, just bend it in a way so it has a thinner profile, and get a good visual of how it's sitting. Right now, there is barely any pressure required here to actually push it down. However, on the left side, there is a ton of pressure. And that pressure is once again coming from an extra set of springs. That is actually part of this EMI shield, so we'll go ahead and snip those off as well. We cannot bend them as there's a chip right under it, so the best way to go about it is to grab it like so, and just tilt it back and forth carefully until it snaps off. Go over it with your fingers, lightly, don't cut yourself, and make sure that it's nice and flat, and inspect it at an angle, making sure that there's nothing poking out. And now, as you can see, the display is sitting relatively nice and comfortably for the most part. And lastly, the last set of tweaks you can do will be on the actual faceplate. And again, your mileage will vary as you may or may not have to do this. So go ahead and grab your razor blade, and what you want to do is to trim these little areas here. Just like so. And sometimes these two tabs on the top left and right corners. All I have to do is to ever so slightly chop them like so. And in extreme cases, you may need to actually go ahead and file down or cut a tiny piece from the corners where you may have some backlight bleed, which is something I had to do on my other unit. Oh yeah, one last thing. You can just chop these down a tiny bit, and that's really about it for all the tweaks that I came up with. Now we can go ahead and move on to the installation process, so I can give you some tips on how to install it safely without breaking anything. So if you have removed your media bar, go ahead and install that first. Leave it dangling like this, move it to the side, and open up these two connectors. That's the backlight, and this is the display connector. Then you want to go ahead and grab your display, make sure it sits over the media bar, and we'll start off by installing the backlight connector. Be extra careful not to scratch anything, just try to line it up until it kind of inserts itself, then open the flap and give it a little nudge, just like that. You'll have a bit of extra connector showing up outside here, it's perfectly normal, and now you can go ahead and close it back up. But here's a trick if you don't want to break this thing with this display. You'll notice that it's still a bit too springy, and if it is, leave it as is. Just give it a little push, but don't clip it in fully. If you do clip it fully, you can potentially break this connector, and you may have issues sometime in the future. Once you have that done, you can go ahead and insert, give it some pressure, and ensure that it's sitting evenly across the connector here. Then you can go ahead and close it back up with your finger. And once that's done, you can go ahead and clip the display back into place. Again, it doesn't have to be perfectly flat, ensuring that this little tab is sitting inside the opening here. It's fine if the display moves around like this. Once you have the faceplate on, it's going to be perfectly secured. Now we can go ahead and close back up the media bar. For the bottom left trim, the best way to actually install it is to insert the little tab into this little gap, twist it over, and secure it into place. Now for the bottom left screw, you can leave it out, but if you want to install it, just slightly tighten it, as we no longer have the little piece under it. If you have issues with these ribbons falling off, you can go ahead and tape them from the other side. As you're putting it on, it will stay in place, and then once you're done putting it together, you can remove your piece of tape. Now we can go ahead and shift the display as needed, making sure that we can get it to sit nice and comfortably. And while holding it like so, we can start screwing things back together. Now usually you'll press down this area as you screw it in to reduce the gap on the bottom, but if you do end up with some extra pressure, you can always go ahead and just unscrew it and then screw it back in, if you don't mind the little gap around here. On 2000 and 3000 models, they always tend to have a gap right around this area for whatever reason. I don't know why, and I guess I'll never know. Maybe one day. Finally, if you've already installed your screen, you'll notice that the top area is no longer under stress. You can comfortably screw it back in without having to flex the whole thing. I'm recording this bit right after I finish the video, but if you find these light leaks annoying, what you can do is use a small piece of electrical tape, and that will take care of it. That's what it looks like on a clear shell at the maximum brightness. This is what it looks like on my red-black shell, one in the middle and a tiny bit right here. As for my marine blue, you can't see it at all, but just thought I'd mention it, as you do have it pretty much all around the display. Alright, so you know what time it is. It's time to go over the data that I've collected over the past week. So let's go through it. And of course, we have our usual handy-dandy notebook, and since we're on the topic of fixing the backlight bleed, let's just go over it one last time. So here's the before and after of two of my units that I've done this procedure on. As you can see, it is a massive difference. Alright, so moving on. If there's one thing that these screens excel at, that would have to be in the brightness department, and it absolutely blows everything out of the water. We got some insane numbers. If you have watched my previous IPS video about the 1000 model, you would know that the brightness levels are pretty low on even the Vitas, which in our previous line of testing, we found that the 1000 IPS screens are in some cases more than double the brightness of a typical PSP. But in the case of the 3000 model, we've got some insane numbers. The highest reading that I've got was around 740 on one of my units here. Of course, this time around, I decided to do some brightness uniformity. We're not going to go over that too much, but if you're interested, the link to the spreadsheet will be in the description down below. That being said, these tests were done using my colorimeter on a pure white screen, running the brightness plugin that allows you to manually adjust exactly what brightness level you're at. Typically for brightness, I use Hold Plus, but in the case of this testing, I need something accurate with numbers I can control. So knowing that it's a bright screen with some relatively uniform brightness levels across the screen, in real life, you would barely notice. On these numbers, yeah, they look like they're all over the place, but trust me, you're not going to notice any brightness uniformity issues like you would on an aging yellowing screen from a 2000, 3000, or even a 1000. Now, if you're a sucker for bright screens like me, you would enjoy these brightness levels, especially outside. Instead of your screen just turning black, you can at least now see your PSP. But here's a comparison of what it looks like with a really bright artificial light source. Well, here's a quick test. Let's go ahead and turn on a light. And now we can't really see much of these displays. However, check this out. All of a sudden, the 3000 IPS is actually somewhat usable. Of course, you're never going to be using it directly in this type of light, but if you were to go ahead and tilt them ever so slightly, as you would when you're playing it, the original display simply cannot keep up, while this thing is almost blowing out the colors on my camera. In real life, this has the more vibrant display, it looks better, it's much clearer, and overall, I would rather look at this thing over that thing in this type of lighting. Because again, this is a brightness monster. Around 700 nits worth of brightness on a PSP is a little bit crazy. You know, it's so bright you can almost use it as a torchlight. The downside to that would have to be the minimum brightness levels. You're going to naturally end up with a brighter backlight on the lowest setting. And yeah, it says 2 nits, 5 nits, that looks pretty low until you look at the original ones where they're almost pretty much 0. Is it a big deal? Well, for some it might be, but at least turn on a little light in the background. It's not good for your eyes if you're playing in a pitch dark room. Now I did go ahead and test it out with and without the screen protector, and yes, it does have a big hit on brightness levels and visual quality. So again, another reason to go ahead and remove it. Now I did go ahead and do some quick testing on various grades of original displays from the LX01, 02, and 03 models that I had on hand. These are the 3 main revisions of the PSP 3000 model, which before the screen came out, I was actually going to make an in-depth video comparing all the original screens from the 3000 model and how you can improve them, but now we have this IPS. However, I'm still keen on making that video because there's actually one more original 3000 display model that only comes on the 7th generation of 3000 models, which happens to be the Chinese model. It comes with a special Toshiba screen that is not cross-compatible with any other model. Now for reference, when it comes to the original screens, the brightest, healthiest screen that I had on hand gave me a maximum of around 251 nits in the middle. This one had a very light case of yellowing, so it's one of my good units. And one of the worst ones that I got 149 nits with some heavy yellowing all around. It's pretty horrible, and we can even take a look at how bad it is in these charts. So that's the same unit right here, 149, and the yellowing corners, 93. Yeah, it's pretty bad. And I don't know what happened to this number. I think I got Hungarianated. As for my good unit, it's honestly pretty uniform, not doing too bad. And finally, when it comes to aftermarket, I think there's like 2 to 3 different grades of these things. They're floating around, and the really good ones you can no longer find. However, for a typical one that you can get nowadays, it's going to have 164 nits, which is pretty low. And these are new aftermarket screens. The displays are usually on the cooler side, the colors are not great, the viewing angles are even worse. So if you got one of those and you want to reference it to these things, well, you can use this video along with the charts here to kind of gauge where you're at. But of course, with these lower nit screens, the brightness is so low I can't even get a reading on my color emitter, so there's that. But honestly, I tried doing that many times and seeing what people experience when they like to play in a pitch dark room, and honestly the colors and the whole thing is just not visually pleasing. So I don't know what's great about running the lowest brightness. Each their own, of course. So that's it for brightness. These displays are crazy bright. They're brighter than the Vitas and the brightest IPS screen on the 1000 model. So we're gonna go ahead and check these off, and we can move on to, I don't know, pixel peeping. So here's what the pixel arrangement looks like. I went ahead and took pictures of all the screens that I had, just for reference. So as you can see, here it is, the glass laminated version. It is an IPS screen with a typical IPS profile. Here's an original, here's a 1000 IPS, and I might as well just display everything here on screen, just for your reference. I just thought I'd post it. It's pretty interesting, especially the matte IPS screen on the 1000. You can see how it's kind of hazy, which is how it does anti-reflection. But yeah, pretty interesting stuff. But one thing we can deduce from this is that, yes, it is in fact a 480 by 272 pixel display. So there's no weird scaling going on. Visually it looks right. On the microscope it looks right. The only reason this one is bigger than this one is probably because how I cropped it and how I was focusing things, as the 1000 display and the 3000 displays were at different heights. And now we move on to something that you've probably been waiting for, and that is the battery performance. How does it compare to the original displays? Well, long story short, it's better. How much better? Well, first, let's talk about the testing methodology. First of all, we use the latest and greatest battery testing application, being Battery Steve. It's an application that I help test and introduce different features that's going to help us a lot in videos like these. It gives you a full log, as well as a built-in and website chart generator. I'll have a video about it in the future where we go into all the features and show you how I perform my test. That being said, it is a heavy application, so don't expect the numbers that you see on Yantest where they're like 7 hours, because those ones are simply unrealistic. That one is basically a GIF with a little soundtrack playing in the background, and that's about it. And my GTA Liberty City test is also not the most realistic one, as it's not indicative of a typical load. So with that in mind, take these numbers with a grain of salt. Don't think that the batteries that we're using or the panels that we're using here are going to give you these type of numbers. All we're here for is to see if it's more power efficient or not. So with that in mind, here's what we have. We started off using a 1400 mAh all-stand battery, which is one that I have abused over a year and a half ago during my battery testing video. And being on max brightness, which is usually around 700, 720, sometimes 740, we got 2 hours and 34 minutes. Then we did a test where we ran both screens, the original and the IPS ones, at around 240 nits, which is roughly what the default brightness is when it's set to high on a stock PSP. And we got 3 hours 39 minutes on the IPS and 3 hours 19 minutes on the original. It may not look like much, but the good news is it does not consume more battery. Instead, it actually uses less batteries. So for those who want to maximize the battery life, that's one way you could do it. Then we once again did the same test on a different set of panels, as well as with a different battery, and when punching these numbers in, we get an average increased battery life of 11.7%. Pretty impressive if you ask me. And if we were to count how much battery life you would lose when you jump from 240 nits to maximum brightness on the IPS, it's about 30% more battery drain. Now you think that's all the testing we've done, but we went ahead, did a little extra at the end, and that will be running our PSP purely on AC power through a USB power meter and swapping out our screens while they're both running at 240 nits. And although the expected results are not the same, what we do know for sure is that it does use less power, even though this test was a bit flawed. And if you happen to be using the Hold Plus plugin, brightness level 2 is roughly around 230 nits, just for your reference. So there you go, it uses less battery, it's more power efficient, and it can get super bright when you need it. Of course, at the cost of battery life. And that's it for the battery testing results. Okay, so before we move forward, I do want to give you guys an idea of where the aftermarket screens stand. as I do want to focus on what's important in the final set of tests. So again, we have the original and two different grades of aftermarket screens. Long story short, they're pretty much using the exact same tech as the original Sonys, and they most likely come from factory rejects. They are either complete rejects or a combination of actual aftermarket parts combined with original Sony rejected parts. Nobody knows for sure where these came from, but that's the most likely situation. And being a mix of original, aftermarket, and rejected parts, well, you're going to have a big variation of these screens. And they usually come with the following set of problems. With PSP 2000 aftermarket screens, I think they come with a 90% chance of a defective screen, like really, really bad. Because in the past, I've probably ordered like 15 2000 screens and like maybe 2.5 kind of work. But with the 3000, I think they have more like a 15 or 20% chance of coming defective. Other than that, if they do end up working, well, you're going to have a combination of the following. Bad viewing angles, bad backlight, really washed out colors, worse interlacing, pretty much worse in every aspect compared to the originals. In some cases, you would get a really good unit, which I did have one at some point, and I have no idea where I put it, and it would have a beautiful 350 nit display backlight, slightly worse colors, slightly worse viewing angles, but with a really nice clean backlight. I did order again from the same seller and did not get the same panel. That's that. And how you can tell an original from an aftermarket is through a label. The original ones simply have a label on the back with a barcode, that usually end with LX01, 02, or 03, and that's about it. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and remove these from the equation. Wrong application. And focus on these four. Original 3000, Laminated 3000 IPS, an original 2000, and an IPS 1000. And we have the 2000 here for two reasons. One is that once they release the 2000 version of this display, well, I guess you could use this video until I make that video for reference. And speaking of reference, of course, it's going to play a key part when we start talking about the color gamut. So let's go ahead and get started by talking about interlacing and ghosting. So when it comes to ghosting, you'll be surprised that the 3000 original display has the least amount of ghosting compared to all the other ones here. It's pretty amazing how well it deals with ghosting, but you could say that is to be expected, as RPS are famous for having various different types of issues. And that might be one reason why Sony decided to go with this type of display. Maybe they thought interlacing was a good trade-off for ghosting. Because when you think about the original 1000 and 2000 screens, you'll know that they have a really bad case of ghosting. The original 2000 was alright in my opinion, but the original 1000 was pretty terrible. That being said, second in place comes actually the 3000 IPS. Comparing these screens side by side, it does have a considerable amount of ghosting compared to the original, which almost looks like it's got nothing. In third place would be the IPS 1000, and in fourth place, of course, is the original 2000. Now, is it as bad as it looks? Honestly, no. When you compare all the other benefits, including the bright screen, the clean, even visuals across the display when it comes to color, when it comes to contrast, no weird blotchiness, which we'll take a look at in just a bit, and of course, the lack of interlacing, makes the visual quality overall considerably better, and we'll talk more about it in the conclusion. So when we check the ghosting test purely on those simple objects, the 3000 looks like a clear winner. However, when we do an actual panning scene shot, visually to my eyes, the two IPS screens look a whole lot better and visually clearer than the original 3000 screen, as the interlacing issue is now way more visible than it was with a simple white object on a black background. There's no doubt about it that the 3000 IPS laminated display is an absolute winner when it comes to visual clarity. And for that, we have the colored version of the test, and once again, the IPS 3000 display is a clear winner in this case. Just take a look at the green wheels and how they're reacting. That will give you an extra idea. And by the way, this is another application that is made by Cootsy, who also made Battery Steve. These beautifully drawn cards are by me, thank you very much. But yeah, this application is called Screenweaver. It's fantastic. I helped implement a lot of new features on it that Cootsy worked hard on, so I can use it to test in time for this video. And links for Battery Steve as well as Screenweaver will be in the description down below. Now moving on, knowing the IPS screen uses an FBA chip to translate what the PSP is giving to work with the IPS screen, one concern that you may have is frame skip. So for that, we have this test where the box moves every single frame. And checking with a slower camera, it's clear that there are no frame skips whatsoever, so that's cool. And speaking of which, we might as well talk about response time. I've tried my best to test this out multiple times with the limited tools that I have. Running these tests at 240 frames, I simply could not find a difference. They both look equally fast, so it shouldn't be an issue that you should worry about. Now let's go ahead and talk about color and contrast, which in my opinion is the biggest difference between the IPS and the original. Now with this simple test, it might be hard to actually see on camera, but actually it's kind of clear. The original Sony screen is by far the most colorful and the best contrasty display out of all the original Sony displays, except for the PSP Go. It's very similar. In fact, the PSP Go is slightly better. No doubt about it, if you have a healthy unit, looks the greatest when it comes to pure color and contrast. But is that the full story? And should you base your decision purely on the color and contrast levels of the original compared to the aftermarket? Well, before we can answer that, let's keep going through the test here. What we have here are various screenshots that I've taken over a year ago for my original IPS comparison video for the 1000 model, and they're helping us out here once again. And I guess you can kind of cross-reference things with that video if you want it. But essentially, things still look definitely a bit more vibey on the original display. But why is that? Well, one thing for sure, it is the yellowing screen. Those defects definitely do give a bit of charm to the original displays here. But at the same time, you might start noticing things if you start looking closer. And I mean actually closer. Take a look at this trunk right here and compare it to the IPS. You'll notice that there are actually visible lines going across it, even though this is a static image. It is also something that we don't have on the 2000, nor do we have the IPS screen here. This is like an image that you printed at a store, while this one looks like it was printed with a home printer that is out of calibration. And that is of course because of Sony decided to go with this type of screen to most likely eliminate ghosting, while introducing interlacing and some weird pixel arrangement, like we have seen with the microscope shots that we have taken a look at earlier. It is definitely a much cleaner image, setting aside contrast and color on the IPS. Now do keep in mind that I don't have the actual brightness levels matched exactly across these displays for this test, so if I say something that does not completely match up with what you're seeing here, that might be why, plus the camera and all that stuff. Looking at things from my angle, I feel like the clearer screen is again the 3000 IPS here. But of course, we'll get to that test in just a bit. Here's my favorite screenshot. It is a beautiful vibrant image from Sega Rally Championship. At first glance, these look very similar. But this one, since it has a yellowing screen, it is a more of a warmer tone, and it can sometimes make an already vibrant image a bit more pleasing. Out of all the skies that we have here, the ones on the 2000 and the 3000 IPS are the most natural looking. The blues and whites, in my opinion, look the most correct, while the one on the 3000 is a bit on the warmer tone, while the one on the 1000 has an ever so slightly greenish tone. Here's a very boring image, and to my eyes, these look very similar, but again, a bit clearer on this one right here. And I think you get the idea at this point. Now we can move on to talk about the contrast levels, but first, let me adjust all the screens here so they're about the same brightness, just so we can have a proper reference point. Which now they are, roughly around 200 nits, which is the maximum that this 2000 unit that I have can get to. And we adjusted the camera here so the visual difference is much clearer. And as you can see, on a pure black screen, the original 3000 is hands down the winner. Much better contrast for sure. Followed by the 3000 IPS, the 1000 IPS, and lastly the original 2000. But it's not the full picture until we go ahead and do a gray screen test, which if you don't know, is the simplest form of test you could do if you think your screen doesn't look right. Put a light grayish color and you'll start seeing all sorts of problems on your screen if you have any, as it will show any defects or inconsistencies that you may have on your screen. And boy, do we have a lot when we look at the original screens on the left here. On the 3000, we have a bunch of blotchiness. We have some kind of weird lines, they're kind of blurry. We can see the yellowing halo effect. While the 2000 is in a much worse condition, it's almost like we have a CRT filter on top of the screen here, which has kind of a vignette all around it. It does give it some aesthetic, but if you're looking for pure visual quality, this is not it. Otherwise, from the middle here, it's somewhat alright, but still not perfect. And the further you go up with the gray color, you'll start seeing the color differences between these screens here. Again, yellowing screen on the 3000 now looks like it has somewhat of a greenish tinge. It's definitely not very appealing. The 2000 looks like it's got a very sad look to it, but when we take a look at the right side for a change, man, is it better. Clean visuals across the entire display, nice even colors. If anything, you might have a slight visible halo all around the edges of the top and the bottom of the display, where the backlight layer kind of bounces back and forth. But that's about it. It's pretty good, and that's to be expected from a modern display that is recently made. And again, you can check this out on your own display using Screenweaver, links will be in the description down below. But yeah, that's pretty much it for the contrast test and the color evenness test. The original 3000 definitely wins in terms of color and contrast, only if your screen is in a healthy, good condition. Otherwise, you're most likely going to have all sorts of varying levels of issues, which we cannot do a test on because there are various levels of issues that you can get at various different degrees. And the one I have picked here is the most average one out of the bunch. It's been taken care of, yet still has the typical 3000 issues. So with that said, we can move on to talking about the viewing angles. And this test is best done on a realistic image, but for reference, here's what it looks like on this black screen. First one to go is the 2000 original display, and somewhat with the 3000, but it's actually very hard to tell until you actually go from a different angle, which is honestly unrealistic. Nobody's going to use their PSP this way. And when it comes to IPS screens, you'll notice that they always have this weird effect. So for that, let's exit out and take a look at some menu screens, which Now it is much clearer on what's going on. We can see that the 2000 and the 3000 are pretty much washing out, while the IPS screens are still holding their own. Now, the 1000 IPS is a bit further from the actual lens, so the light is kind of bouncing back and forth as there's an air gap, but with the Laminated IPS 3000, it is doing a whole lot better since it does not have that air gap. So the glass lens on top of the display has a layer of clear liquid that is bonding it perfectly without any air gaps, any dirt, giving us a much clearer image. Looking at it from an angle like this, yes, it does fade a little bit, but you're most likely going to be using it like this, because who's going to use their PSP like that? So yes, the clear winner is the IPS 3000 glass, followed by the 1000 IPS. You could say the 3000 original, and in last place, the original 2000. And the last thing I want to go over here is the color space option that only exists on the 3000 and PSP Go models. Basically, this is the option that gives these models their very vibrant colors. And it happens to be the one option that people suggest you turn off if you have a severe case of yellowing. So let's see why. And now if we go ahead and drop it to normal, we can see that it has turned a bit on the bluish side, but even more so on the IPS. And when we go ahead and stack them as such, while the 3000 units are running on the normal color space, you can somewhat tell at various different levels that they now look similar to the 2000 model. Not so much on this light gray screen, but before we go ahead and switch it to something more realistic, here's what these look like in comparison with the white gamut on this light gray screen. Which for reference, once again, looks a little something like this. While the original and IPS are running on the wide mode, now it's much clearer when we go ahead and set them to the normal color mode that they now look closer to the 2000 model. Finally, when setting the original to normal, the IPS to wide, and comparing it to the 2000 screen, we can now say they almost look very similar, and can now use that as a reference point after you're done watching this video. You can pick up your PSP 3000, set it to normal colors, and then you can get a better idea of what the IPS screen sort of looks like. Likewise with the 2000 screen, except the colors and contrast, of course, are a little bit better than the 2000. But overall, it should give you a general idea. And finally, just so we can check it off our list, here's a thermal view of what these screens look like. Doesn't matter what we have on screen because the glass lenses here are most likely reflecting and giving us some weird readings. But it is interesting to see that the 1000 is actually the least hot here. However, it is interesting to see that the IPS does look a little bit hotter. Maybe it's transferring the heat better because we have a glass lens on the top, but according to our battery and power test, it should not consume more power. Thus, we should not see more heat being produced. And just for the fun of it, here's what the backs look like. So, can't believe I'm finally here, but we are at the conclusion. We have went through everything, and now it is time to just chill, which I'll be doing with some good old Outrun. So it's kind of been a roller coaster. Things initially, at first glance, do look a whole lot better, but then I started looking at the colors, and I was like, oh man, they're not as good as the original. But to be honest, after digging deep and going through all the different tests that I've shown you in this video, I can confidently say that the IPS is a substantial upgrade to the original display. With all things considered, the only real downside would have to be a little bit of loss of color. But in return, we get a massive upgrade in clarity, uniformity, brightness, which is absolutely insane, and I think it's definitely worth the upgrade. If you're kind of reluctant on it, and you have a healthy 3000 display, and you don't feel like you're lacking anything, then keep it. It's perfectly fine, even with a little bit of yellowing, it's not a big issue. But if you're really sick of your display, you got a major case of interlacing, yellowing, and it's dim and it's uneven and all that blurry stuff, you know what to do. Is it expensive? Yes. Considering that you can buy a PSP 3000 for that price, or sometimes even much cheaper, it is. But you have to consider that this is a custom display for a 20-year-old console. It's not really easy to make these things. And one argument that's been going around is that this is the same pricing that you get for those Game Boy displays. So I guess that's the standard. But yeah. I'm really looking forward to the future. Can't wait to see what the non-laminated display has to offer, what the 2000 version has to offer, and for those who have the rare 07G Chinese model, although you're left out at this moment with this revision, they will be in fact releasing a dedicated 07G IPS display upgrade, so keep an eye out for that. I'll make sure to keep you guys up to date in the pinned comment, as well as my community post. But yeah, if you guys have enjoyed this video, if you want to help support the channel, use the links in the description down below, or even maybe check out the Ko-fi link if you want to help fund future videos. And with all that being said, that is all for this video. Now just gotta go ahead and make that thumbnail, and then I can finally enjoy myself some blur-free Arctic Edge. As this game is very susceptible to blur, as things tend to blend in due to the color palette. Or perhaps some good old Need for Speed Carbon. Either way, I'm pretty excited, and I can already tell what the comments are gonna say. OLED when? And then you're gonna have a comment replying to that comment, saying something like, bro, just get a Vita. But at the same time, I would do that, and this channel would possibly not exist if the Vita could play all my PSP games in native resolution. Until that happens, I'll be rocking the Alta Portable. And that's it. See you guys in the next one, and take care, everyone.